This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and receive exclusive perks. Link in the description. There's two little magic words that always manage to get our brains buzzing. What if? Theories are so fun, especially in long-running shows and series where there is so much material to play with. Sometimes characters aren't fully utilized, or sometimes stories are left ambiguous, or perhaps the author will suggest something that contradicts the stories as written. And as humans, we love to dissect those details and make sense of it all. That's what makes theorizing so fun. As long as there's enough evidence to back up a claim, any theory can seem plausible. I asked you all about a month ago here what were some of your favorite Thomas and Friends theories, and you all posted some very interesting takes. So today I thought it'd be fun to go through a few of the more popular ones, and give you all my own assessment of them. Do I think they're plausible or not? I really should emphasize that everything that we'll be discussing here today are regarding theories, not headcanons. And it's admittedly kind of hard to differentiate the two. In my mind, theories are hypotheticals that work within the universe as established without changing any details, while a headcanon is more along the lines of changing details in the universe to make your own take work, if that makes sense. There being two different Henrys pre- and post-rebuild is a theory, while trying to work Emily into the Railway series as a Sodor and mainland engine, for example, is a headcanon. I'm going to try to keep clear of headcanons as much as I can for this video, but a few may slip in.
Whoa. Hold up a minute. Were you about to make a video about Thomas theories without me, the Thomas theorist?
Wait, what? What are you doing here?
You left the door open when Trampy was last here.
Oh, right. Well, I guess I can't do a Thomas theories video without the Thomas theorist himself, right?
Exactly. Ernie.
Fellow Thomas Tuber, the Thomas theorist, will be joining us for the ride today, and will provide some of his own insight into a few of the theories discussed here. And I also really must reiterate, these are all theories. None of these are fact or true, and we're here today simply to speculate and give our own opinions on these. If you believe something different, well, that's totally fine, and you should comment it below so we can discuss it. This is all just for fun, after all, so take everything talked about here with a grain of salt. It's Thomas the Tank Engine. It's not that serious. Alright, let's jump in. We'll start with the Railway series, and work our way up to the more modern stuff. The Two Henrys Theory. Let's start this video off with probably the most discussed Thomas theory of all time, whether or not there were, in fact, two Henrys. Henry started life as a failed experimental 462 express engine, built in 1919 from discarded designs of Sir Nigel Gresley. He suffered from a small firebox, and could not steam properly. Sold to the Northwestern Railway in an elaborate scam, Henry stayed on Sodor, and remained a thorn in Topham Hatt I's side for several years.
You're too expensive, Henry. You've had lots of new parts and new paint, but they've done you no good.
Early one fateful morning in 1935, Henry had a major accident, colliding with a goods train, which left him in quite a deplorable state. Hatt sent Henry off to the LMS's main workshops and crew, and the next year, a completely different-looking Henry returned, in the form of a 460 Black 5 locomotive, and was a much better steamer. It is quite a mystery how a transformation of an engine was even possible. Many claim it to be totally unrealistic. Admittedly, some suspension of disbelief is needed to accept it, but what if the Henry that came back from crew wasn't the one that was sent away at all? The Island of Sodor book leaves the details purposely vague, but it does state that since 1922, there have been two Henrys. This is where the theory stems from. Many have taken this in a more literal sense, and believe the more realistic scenario of this. The first engine was so badly damaged after the crash that it was scrapped, and Hatt brought a new modern Black 5 to take its place and its number. If this were real life and the engines weren't alive, This is probably what would have happened. But the engines are alive, and Topham Hatt I was a sympathetic man, as shown on many occasions. It's also a little hard to believe because Henry II is treated wholly as the same character prior to his rebuild, with the same memories and all. He remembers the tunnel incident, the Kipper crash, etc.
And he ran away singing, "Once an engine attached to a train was afraid of a few drops of rain." "Be careful, Henry," he said. "You're not pulling the flying Kipper now. Mind you keep on the rails today." Henry snorted away.
You also have to wonder what exactly the benefit of masquerading an all-new engine as Henry would be. Did Topham do this intentionally to hide the fact he scrapped Henry from the other engines, so they wouldn't rebel? Gets pretty dark the more you think about it. As far-fetched as it is, I personally believe that Henry I and Henry II are the same engine. An engine being rebuilt into a completely different one is not totally unheard of. A good example of this is Aerolite, which currently resides at the National Railway Museum in York. This is a tank engine which changed its overall appearance and wheel configuration 4 times over its service life. It started as a very primitive-looking 222 in 1869, then was rebuilt with side tanks in 1886, then became a 422 in 1892, and then was completely rebuilt into a 224 in 1902. It took on a lot of new parts over its life, and its appearance changed drastically, but was still officially recognized as the same engine. The same can be said for the various engines that got rebuilt at Swindon. Take the Taff Vale tank engines, for example. They used to look like this, and then looked like this once they were refitted with newer standard parts. They are still technically the same engines, though, despite their very different appearance. What I believe occurred is that crew used the frames and whatever else that was salvageable of the original Henry, and fitted that with Stanier-designed parts. New boiler, new cab, etc. And the end result was an engine that resembled a Black 5. A Stanierized Gresley, if you will. Granted, we're getting into headcanon territory here, but that's my take on it. The two Henrys theory gets a big ol' no from me. Henry I and Henry II are the same engine.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Technically, the illustrations are not canon, which is weird to think about. But I think the reason why we don't really know what Henry I looked like was because Wilbert, in the canon of the Railway series, never actually met him. He only ever met rebuilt Henry, which might explain his ambiguous shape in the Railway series.
Engines only have faces on Sodor. On page 197 of Wilbert Awdry's biography, The Thomas the Tank Engine Man, he states this: "My rule is that the faces are allowable in the books since the engines are in Sodor, where anything can happen and usually does. But that is not so in England." The world of the Railway series takes place in the real world, and Awdry's stance that the reason we don't see faces on engines out in the real world is because they can only be seen when they are on Sodor. Sodor, of course, is not a real place, so it's a coy way of saying that engines aren't actually alive, without actually stating so. He even goes on to list some examples, such as in domeless engines, where City of Truro is drawn specifically from a rear angle, so it's ambiguous if he has a face or not, before he came up with the rule. This is a pretty known idea across the fandom. Diesel D199 even did a whole short parody in this. Once Thomas left Sodor territory...
But what about in the Fat Controller's engines when we...
His face Thanos, and he became an ordinary, non-alive steam engine. But is this rule consistent? Well, not exactly. There is some evidence to support it, and some evidence against it. In the Railway series, whenever a story talks about a real steam engine in the world, the illustrations usually show said engine as they look in real life, no face and all. We've seen Talyclyn a couple times with no face, and when Stepney talks about the Bluebell engines, none are shown with faces. So, in these instances, Awdry's claim is correct. The engines are not on Sodor in these instances, so they would be depicted without faces. However, there's way more evidence against the claim. In the same book, we get this gruesome shot of some mainland engines in a scrapyard, both depicted with faces. We get this shot of Stepney presumably traveling to Sodor and stopping at a big station, him and the flock of diesels he meets, all depicted with faces. The diesels that search for Oliver during his escape all have faces, as does Isabel in what is meant to be a flashback to Oliver's service years. When Thomas goes to the National Railway Museum in York, he has a face the entire trip, as do all the other engines he meets there, with one exception. When we see flashbacks to Toby's early years, he, his brothers, and the old engine that he comes across all have faces. Hell, the entire first story of Toby's book takes place in East Anglia, where Toby is depicted with a face. Now, the real reason this rule is inconsistent is, well, these are visual books, and it only makes sense to personify the characters of a story for the reader to understand what's happening, especially if that character is core to the story. It'd just be strange for Thomas not to have a face throughout an entire book where he's the main character of it. On the contrary, when Stepney talks about the Bluebell engines, they don't need faces for us to understand them because they're not really characters in the story. And it reinforces that in these moments, these engines the characters are talking about are, in fact, real ones. And so, this rule is inconsistent. Audrey has gone on record of saying that the illustrations in these books are never really accurate. The real-world version of the Railway series differs from what the illustrations literally show us, for they have artistic license. So, do I buy into this theory? I'm going to say no, just because it is so inconsistent. I think the explanation was simply Audrey's way of explaining to young fans that engines aren't alive in the real world without actually stating so. In the way that I personally choose to see the series, all engines across the world are all alive in one way or another in this universe. Two-faced engines. Okay, this one really messes with me. The theory is that all engines with a cab at each end, this would mostly include big diesels like Boco or Daisy, have a face at each end. Yeah, two faces at once. This is absolutely not the case in the TV series, where they consistently only have one face on their front ends. In the Railway series, though, there is some evidence for this theory. For one, I don't think we have ever seen one end of Boco or Daisy without a face on it. We get close to seeing Boco's rear here, but it's cut off and not clear enough to be conclusive. The proof comes in stories like Daisy. In this one, Daisy's face is on her front end, facing west about to depart Farquhar. When she discovers a milk van is being coupled behind her, suddenly her face is on her rear end, looking at it, now facing the opposite direction. Now how is that possible if there isn't a face on either end of her? In Wrong Road, Boco enters the docks facing Gordon, with a face on his front as per the norm. In the very next illustration, he is pulled forward alongside Gordon, with his face now on the other end, facing in the other direction. In Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree, Boco is seen with a face on his rear end again, facing the opposite direction of everyone else. Now, it's not exclusively an all diesels rule, as smaller diesels with only one cab, like Mavis or Diesel, are depicted with only one face, and nothing on their rears. There is one curveball that throws a wrench into this theory, and that is Toby. Toby, like the big diesels, is also an engine with a cab at each end. Most of the time, we see his face on his proper front, the end with his chimney. In Toby's Megatrain, we get our only instance of his face appearing on his rear end, opposite the end his chimney is on. However, unlike Daisy and Boco, we have seen Toby's rear a couple times before, and in these instances, no face. So, what do we make of that? Well, here's my take on the theory. I don't think these engines always have two faces at the same time. They have the ability to change which side of them their face appears on, depending on the direction of travel that they're going in. Now, it's a weird thing to imagine, I know, but it's the only way I can really make sense of this. The only exception to this take is the Coley Fell engines, which are totally weird monstrosities in their own right. They are all single-cabbed, but they also have a face on each end to see the line ahead of them on their return journeys. But the rear faces are clearly apparent in instances when they are traveling forwards. So I don't know what to make of this. Personally, I like to think that the rear faces are just mute and don't talk. Imagine them and the front ones talking at the same time. Would that even be possible? Could Coldy talk to himself? Unfortunately, I think I have to give the two faces theory a very reluctant yes. There is too much evidence to be able to disprove it. It's a weird one, and I think it originated simply for the sake of illustrations. Having Daisy be able to see the van being coupled to her, or having Boco and Gordon alongside each other, visually communicate what's happening in the scene a bit better than if there were no faces there at all.
I would have to say yes as well. Huh, with all this face talk, I guess you could say it's a grey area. Nobody? Okay.
Wilbert and 16 are the same engine. This is a very interesting theory, and I do not know who was the first person to coin it. The character, Wilbert, is a real engine, and is one of Hunslet's many austerity 060 saddle tank engines. The engine was built in 1953, worked in collieries for all its service life, before being preserved on the Dean Forest Railway. In 1987, the engine was christened as Wilbert, after Reverend Wilbert Awdry himself. And because of this, Christopher Awdry decided to make Wilbert a character in the Railway series, and had him visit Sodor in Book 38, Wilbert the Forest Engine. In the story Cab Over Wheels, Wilbert tells Thomas and Toby about an engine that he knew of that was the same class as him. The engine had no name and was simply known by his number, 16. 16 worked at a steelworks. He was careless one day and decided to slip past a danger sign on a tip. The shaky ground crumbled beneath him, and 16 toppled Cab Over Wheels onto his side. He was rescued and sent to the shed in disgrace, but fortunately was bought by a preservation society in the Midlands. Wilbert does not actually appear in the flashback of the story, and is never actually seen talking to 16. It's never explained how he actually knew him in the first place. There's also the fact that we don't know which of the 70 preserved austerity tank engines 16 is meant to be, or if he's simply a fictional additional one. This has led some to theorize that Wilbert and 16 are the same engine. Wilbert, ashamed of his past, hid the fact that he was the one who toppled over after being naughty, and fibbed about the engine being somewhere in the Midlands now. This would explain why 16 is never shown interacting with Wilbert, or why we can't seem to find a definitive basis for him. This is a really inspired theory, but unfortunately it is easily debunked by the fact Wilbert is meant to be a real engine. A real engine with a real history. The real Wilbert worked in collieries its entire life, and never at a steelworks. Nor has it ever worn the number 16. So unfortunately, the Wilbert is 16 theory gets a no from me. However, I don't think it's impossible that Wilbert simply made up 16, and the whole story, just to tell a tale to the others. That also explains why there is no real-life 16 out there, and it doesn't contradict the real Wilbert's history. Unless Chris Awdry ever comes forward with confirmation on the details, we will simply never know. Everyone on Sodor has lead poisoning. Okay, this one is kind of hilarious. I need to explain some backstory for this one. So back in the 19th and early 20th century, the narrow-gauge Mid-Sodor Railway ran to several mines towards the west of Sodor. When the mines dried out, the railway closed, and all that was left were waste heaps from the closed mines. In the 1960s, Sir Charles Hatt and the other controllers discovered these leftover heaps made for good railway ballast, as weeds didn't grow in them, and thus required little maintenance.
The gangers are pleased. Weeds don't grow in it, they say.
So the railway's controllers all went in on building the 15-inch gauge miniature Arlesdale Railway to transport the spoils to Arlesborough, and from there to all the railways of the island. The Northwestern, all the branch lines, the Skarloey Railway, and the Goldie Fell. There was just one issue. The spoils were from lead mines. Yes, they coated the entire island with lead. Now, it was the 60s, and the dangers of lead poisoning weren't that commonly known at the time. In modern day, no doubt this all would have just been dug up and replaced with something else. But the theory goes that all the people on Sodor during this time became delusional from lead poisoning, Audrey included, thus explaining why they thought they saw faces on the trains and thought they could talk. It's actually a hilarious theory, but, of course, I gotta say no to this one. This is clearly a joke theory. I don't think anyone actually believes this one. Though if we are to treat it seriously, Audrey likely did not know about the dangers of lead poisoning then, so there's no way that this could have ever been intentional. It is pretty funny in retrospect though. They unintentionally made Sodor a giant hazard zone. Good thing it's an island. Let's get into some TV series theories now. Thomas and Duck hate each other. So this is a theory that I actually came up with and suggested in my Sodor's Finest on Duck. It's pretty straightforward. Thomas and Duck do not like each other, and is supported through many of their interactions. Here's a list. In Duck's second ever appearance, The Runaway, Thomas is ill, so Duck is asked to run his branch line while he's away. Annie and Clarabelle are impressed with him, and when Thomas returns, he becomes jealous.
Annie and Clarabelle told him how well Duck had managed. Thomas was so pleased to be home that he soon forgot to be jealous.
So right away, not getting off on the best foot with each other. In Grandpuff, the engines are all unable to fall asleep during a snowstorm, so Thomas tells them a story about Duke. Duck, specifically, requests the story must have a happy ending.
But, added Duck, it must have a happy ending.
However, Thomas inexplicably decides to cut the story short, and doesn't finish it that night.
That's not a happy ending. Ah, murmured Thomas sleepily. There will be, but that'll have to wait until next time.
So, what did they all do after that? Did they just sit there in awkward silence? Thomas only chooses to finish the story months later on a night when Duck isn't in the shed. Duck requested the happy ending, and he's the only one who doesn't get to hear it. Thomas really is that petty. In Fish, Thomas tries to warn Duck to be careful of Fish.
Hello, Duck. Going fishing? I'd take care if I were you. Why? Huffed Duck.
And Duck immediately is standoffish to him. Thomas, rightfully, is insulted and goes off in a huff.
And I know what I'm talking about. Good night.
In Scaredy Engines, it's Duck's idea to leave Thomas behind while he and Percy head home. Thomas ends up getting spooked in the night, and Duck takes great joy in it.
He's after me! I don't think you'll be late, said Duck.
In Spotless Record, Duck passes Thomas and whistles at him, and Thomas doesn't whistle back.
That evening, Arthur was having the squashed fruit cleaned out of his funnel.
And then even way later on in the CGI series, there's an episode that is fully about Thomas and Duck working together, in which they do not get along and argue the entire time. Thomas and Duck's personalities would conflict with each other. They are both very prideful and egotistical characters, but in different ways. Thomas is cheeky and thinks he's all that and is the most important engine of the railway, while Duck is more of a stickler for the rules and prideful in the way that he does things. Of course he would be the one to bring down Thomas's fun, and of course Thomas would take that personally, and the cycle continues. I absolutely love this theory just because of how petty that they've been with each other, but as much as it pains me to say this, I don't actually think any of this was intentional. So, it gets a no. I highly doubt any of the show's writers thought the two disliked each other, and there have been moments here and there where the two have been quite chummy. Their character clash is definitely material ripe for story potential, though.
I love theories like this because it really plays into the strength of Thomas and Duck's character. One prides himself on his branch line, while the other prides himself on the Great Western. But it feels more like a headcanon to me rather than a theory, so I'm gonna say no.
Thomas's Lost Brothers. So a while ago, I had a theory regarding the plethora of scrapped engines we see used in scrapyards of the show. You might notice a lot of them look pretty similar to Thomas, huh? why exactly are there so many scrapped Thomases on Sodor? The real reason is simply just for set dressing. The crew used molds of some of the main characters to create spare engines to fill scrapyards. We see a couple Gordons, some Donald and Douglases, a city of Truro even, and many, many Thomases, or simply generic E2 class tank engines. But the in-universe implications of this are a little unsettling. Thomas has been witness to several of his brothers just dead, lifeless. What are they all doing here? Why would they be on Sodor? The theory goes as such. Back when I was trying to piece together a history for the island of Sodor in the TV series, I tried to make sense of a history for the Farquhar branch, in which I stated the reason there are so many scrapped E2s on Sodor is because a batch of them worked this line prior to the main line being built, Thomas, of course, being one of them. And over time, they all got worn out and were scrapped. Thomas was the last in service and ended up surviving, eventually winding up in Northwestern Railway ownership.
I've always been curious about the story behind these scrapped E2 tank engines. Now, we all know that they're just used as set dressing, obviously, but how do they work into canon? Like, does Thomas not ever feel sad about his lost brothers being scattered across the island? I always liked the idea that these E2 tank engines were the TV series equivalent of the coffee pot engines on the Tidmouth Knapford Nelsbridge Railway from the book's lore. It would also explain why we see one at Bertram's lead mine. It's a fun theory, but I'm not sure how well it holds up into canon, since if that's true, then doesn't that mean City of Truro was also scrapped in the model series canon? I'm not so sure about that one.
I think it's pretty safe to say in hindsight that this theory doesn't really hold true. The scrapped E2s were simply just set dressing. So, this one is getting a no. Daisy was never meant to exist. Okay, now this one is such a deep rabbit hole. Honestly, I could probably do a whole video on this theory alone, because there is a lot to explain here. But the main claim here is that Daisy, the diesel rail car, was never meant to appear in Season 2 originally. Let me explain this as briefly as I can. So, as we all know, Season 2 was kind of a hell of a production for the show. Many episodes were proposed that never went through, and a whole episode, The Missing Coach, was cancelled midway through filming. It was presumably replaced with Better Late Than Ever, as the Tidmouth Station set in that episode differs a bit from the one seen in all the other episodes, suggesting that it was rebuilt to film these pickup shots. Other episodes were cancelled too. Doubleheader and Percy's Promise were also on the roster, and were presumably still a part of the roster during pre-production. The concept art for the new harbor, aka the harbor that Percy works at in Percy and Harold, states that it was meant to appear in episodes 9 and 10. Assuming 9 is Percy and Harold, 10 likely would have been Percy's Promise, as that story takes place right after it in the books. Percy's Promise being in Season 2 would also explain the continuity in Percy Takes the Plunge, where Percy references the events of that story.
It was raining hard. Water swirled under my boiler. I couldn't see where I was going, but I struggled on.
Percy's Promise and Doubleheader got the plug pulled for unknown reasons, and were later adapted early on in Season 3, thus making the mention in Plunge a continuity error, and removing Toby's only lead role of Season 2. So, what replaced those two episodes? Many thought, myself included, that Thomas and Trevor was one of the replacements, as it takes place largely at the New Harbor, and its episode number is not mentioned on the New Harbor concept art. Though this likely isn't the case, as it's based on an annual story that Chris Audrey wrote in accordance with Season 2. Many eyes have turned to the Daisy two-parter, the episodes Daisy and Percy's Predicament. Now, at first, it seems crazy to suggest these because Thomas Comes to Breakfast kicks off that story arc, and that episode was always intended to be a part of this season, considering it takes place entirely on the Tidmouth Station set. However, it's not uncommon for the TV series to split up multi-arc stories from the books. Thomas Comes to Breakfast could have easily just been written as a standalone Thomas story, with the mention of a diesel railcar taking over his work at the end being omitted. We also have to consider the set the majority of these two episodes take place on. Both of these episodes use the Elsbridge set pretty heavily. In fact, aside from 2 shots at the very end of it, Daisy takes place entirely on the Elsbridge set. The Elsbridge set was the final one built for Season 2, as evident by the crew photo. The show crew always took a group photo on their last day of shooting, and clear as day, they are standing over the Elsbridge set. Now this suggests that Daisy and Percy's predicament were filmed at the tail end of Season 2's shoot, which makes sense if they were last-minute replacement episodes. We also have some evidence with Daisy herself, whose prop appears to be a bit cobbled together. She reuses many of Boco's parts, including his chassis and his faces. This sort of suggests that Daisy was a last-minute decision, and her prop was assembled quickly to meet the schedule, using parts from existing characters to finish her. Her prop not existing during the time of the Tidmouth set shoot would also explain why she is the only character not present at the Christmas party in Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree. I mean, come on, even Diesel is there. There is a lot to take in here, but I think it all checks out. Season 2 was a bit of a ramshackle guerrilla-style season, so it's totally believable that these 2 episodes were greenlit midway through production, and thus totally possible that Daisy was never meant to exist. At least, not in Season 2 anyway. This theory is honestly great, with a lot of behind-the-scenes research to support it. This one gets a yes from me. Why Boco Disappeared. Boco is a pretty big topic of discussion in Thomas theories. We've mentioned him a couple times already. So this theory was proposed by my friend Jordan during the making of this video, and I thought it was interesting enough to talk about here. This theory outlines a more concrete in-universe reason to why Boco was strangely never seen again after Season 5. Now many characters have come and gone in this show. Most were brought back at some point in later seasons. Daisy, for example, was such a minor character in the early seasons, and somehow wound up being a pretty big player in the CGI seasons that she appeared in. Though, for some reason, Boco never reappeared. This theory proposes that Boco was on a long-term loan to Sodor, and never actually became a resident of the Northwestern Railway. After Season 5, the loan expired, and he was returned to British Railways on the mainland. Now, I thought there might be some TV canon statement somewhere in an episode or a bio that said Boco became a member of the railway, but to my shock, I couldn't find one. Boco becoming a member of the railway was stated in the books during the epilogue of Edward's exploit.
The Fat Controller asked Boco to look after Edward's line while he was being mended. He worked well, and now they run it together. He lives at Edward's station, but is welcome anywhere, for he is now one of the family.
This epilogue was cut from the episode, meaning there was no actual statement said in the show that Boco became a part of the railway. His official bio only says he originally came to the island of Sodor on loan from British Rail and stayed, but that could easily just be read as he stayed longer than planned. It's a pretty convincing theory, and it would explain why he has always carried his British Railway number, livery, and crest through all his appearances. Contrast to the Railway series, where he was given the Northwestern number, D2. Now, do I think this theory is plausible? Well, as convincing as it is, I'm going to have to say no to it. The show's intention was always that Boco became a part of the railway, even if they cut any confirmation stating as such. Gotta give it to you though, Jordan. A really solid theory here.
The fun thing about characters like Boco or Smudger or any other character that fell by the wayside is that we can theorize really anything that happened to them. A fun theory I like is that all the characters we don't see in the hit era, such as Duck or Boco, are actually the ones doing the hard work behind the scenes while Thomas and the Steam team go off on a bunch of adventures. It's fun to think about what they got up to while they're off screen.
Seems pretty clear which engines do the real work on Sodor, while the others are wasting time with balloons and ice cream and whatever else. The clay pits were destroyed. So this is another theory that I proposed myself, and even stated as much in my old model series timeline video. In the model series canon, Bill and Ben worked the China clay pits till Season 5, and then in Season 6 were inexplicably moved to Farquhar Quarry with Mavis, and remained there till the end of the model era. no reason has ever been stated in-universe why this change occurred. The theory is tied to the events of Season 3's Heroes. In this episode, a freak avalanche occurs and devastates the clay pits. Many of the buildings are destroyed, and all the rail lines buried. So much damage occurred that the company was unable to reopen the works, permanently closing it. With Bill and Ben now without a home, they were moved to Farquhar Quarry to help Mavis. Now there is one major contradiction to this theory, and that is Season 5's double teething troubles. The quarry the twins work at here is clearly the same set used for Farquhar Quarry with some minor changes, but the narrator does state at the beginning that it is in fact the clay pits.
Bill and Ben, the tank engine twins, work in the clay mines and quarries near Brendam Docks.
Now, you could just write this episode off as simply just taking place before Heroes for the theory to work, as I myself have done before, but I think that's getting a bit too much into personal headcanon territory. I'm going to have to give a no to this one. I don't think the clay pits actually ever closed. I imagine Bill and Ben moving to Farquhar was just one of the many little changes made during production of Season 6, when they started simplifying things to make things easier on the new team of writers.
And if I remember correctly, I think the Writer's Bible also says Boco worked at the quarry with Mavis alongside Bill and Ben. I wonder if they just started to treat the quarry as one location just to make it easier for production. Or make things less confusing for the kids, maybe? I'm not sure.
Yeah, why have two different quarries with different engines when you can just have one big quarry with all of them there together and call it Center Island Quarry, right? Bertram and Smudger are the same engine. Now this one is actually kind of fascinating, and to be honest with you all, I think has more plausibility than the Wilbert and 16 theory. Let me explain. Now, I believe this theory was popularized by Thomas I, Edward II, Henry III in his video, The Search for Smudger, a story which revealed Bertram was actually Smudger from Duke's Old Railway. Smudger appears only in a flashback in the episode Grandpuff. He was a reckless engine that worked the Mid-Sodor Railway with Duke in years past, but was so careless that he derailed often.
Listen, Dookie, who worries about a few spills?
Fed up with him, the manager finally decided to make Smudger useful at last, and turned him into a stationary generator behind the shed. What happened to Smudger after that? No one knows. Bertram was an engine that was presumably left abandoned at an old mine that the narrow gauge railway worked. He was later rediscovered by Toby one night, and now works the little tourist line between the mine and the nearby castle. As Bertram is the same class of engine as Duke, it's often believed that the mine was a part of the abandoned Mid-Sodor Railway's network. The theory suggests that these two engines are one and the same. Smudger was relocated from behind the shed and later rebuilt into a working engine for this mine, and was renamed Bertram upon his rebuild. The mine eventually closed, and he was left there until Toby came across him. This theory stems from what I believe are a few reasons. One, the obvious. Bertram and Smudger both use the same face. I have no doubt that this is simply because Bertram only had a couple seconds of screen time, so the show crew saw no point in making all new faces for him when they could just reuse faces from a past character that was never going to appear again. A more concrete reason would be the inspiration for Smudger's story, the real Palmerston of the Festiniog Railway in Wales. In the late 30s, Palmerston had become worn out, and in 1942 was converted into a stationary boiler outside Boston Lodge Works. In the late 50s, it was planned to be scrapped, but was saved by volunteer Ian Waters, who refused to cut the engine up. For a long time, Palmerston remained a hulk of metal rusting away in the yard, thought never to run again. But after many, many years and hard work, it did run again in 1993, and is still in service on the railway today. Palmerston's story serves as a real-life example of an engine-turned-generator can be rebuilt into a working steam engine. And also, by pure chance, Palmerston is also a small England, just like Duke and Bertram. Well, what about the fact that Smudger and Bertram are totally different classes of engines? Smudger, like Rheneas, is based on the real-life Dalgok, an 040 well tank, while Bertram is a small England tender engine. Changing the entire look of an engine is pretty far-fetched, yes, but As the aerolite example earlier showed, it's not impossible. Unlikely, yes, but not impossible. And the last reason this theory is plausible is that, well, we simply don't know a lot about Smudger and Bertram. We have no idea what happened to Smudger after he became a generator, and we know nothing about Bertram's life before being rediscovered. There is zero information there, so it's up to our own interpretations to fill in the blanks. It's not like Wilbert and 16, where one is meant to be a real engine in real life with a history that debunks the theory. These two are totally made up, with plenty to speculate on. Despite all of this though, as interesting as the theory is, I'm still gonna have to say no to this one. I don't think there was ever any intention for Smudger and Bertram to be the same engine. I don't really like how this undoes Smudger's story too. I always liked that he had a really sad ending. Stuff like that made Thomas feel so grounded and real, and retconning that into a happy ending makes it less impactful. Still though, it's a very fun theory, and ripe for story potential. Proteus is the ghost engine. Now this is an extremely popular theory, and I see it treated as canon in several fan videos. In Season 5's Duncan Gets Spooked, Rusty tells Duncan the story of an unnamed saddle tank engine. One night it attempted to cross the old iron bridge, only to topple over and drown in the swamp below, never to be seen again. The story is ambiguous, and the episode makes a clear effort to leave it as such. Did the engine actually exist? Was its ghost really trying to make contact with Duncan? Or was it all simply in Duncan's head? 4 seasons later, in The Magic Lamp, Skarloey tells the others the story of another lost saddle tank engine that existed long ago on the railway, called Proteus. Not much is known about what happened to him, but he had a magic lamp that could grant wishes. Proteus disappeared mysteriously, and his legend is kept alive in modern day. But again, like the ghost engine, it's left ambiguous if Proteus was actually real or not. Many people choose to believe that Proteus and the ghost engine are, again, one and the same. And just like Bertram and Smudger, this theory is plausible for a couple reasons. First off, we never get a good look at the ghost engine. We know it actually is just a repainted Skarloey, but we never see its face, and its shape is similar-ish to Proteus. It's totally shrouded in mystery. Who's to say that isn't just Proteus covered in dirt and rust from years of work? Secondly, there is a lot left here to interpretation. Like Smudger, we don't know what happened to Proteus after, and like Bertram, we don't know what the ghost engine's life was before the incident. Our brains, once again, just desire to make those connections. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say that the writers did not intend for these engines to be one and the same, but this is one of those theories that I actually want to be true. Proteus's legend is so well regarded and honored in the universe's modern day. Why would people want to honor an engine if something significant didn't happen to him, right? An engine with an alleged magic lamp trying to communicate supernaturally doesn't seem too out of the question either, does it? Fully knowing that I should follow my own rules and probably say no to this theory, I'm still going to say yes. I love this theory, and it's a nice little connection between the classic and hit eras. When does Thomas and the Magic Railroad take place? I remember seeing this one float around Twitter a few years ago, and even today I see it brought up in videos on occasion. The theory suggests that the 2000 film Thomas and the Magic Railroad is canon and occurs during the events of Season 2. There's some interesting tie-ins to this. The biggest thing is the cast. The only characters from the show to appear in this are the 7 main engines, sans Edward, but we'll get to that, Bertie the Bus, and Harold the Helicopter. All Season 1 characters, with the exception of Harold, who was introduced towards the beginning of Season 2. The other interesting parallel is the viaduct being under repair. Throughout most of Season 2, the viaduct on the main line is under repair. It's coated in scaffolding, and a speed restraint is put on the engines while crossing it. The viaduct that appears in the movie is also in need of repair, slowly crumbling away, and finally collapsing during the movie's climax. So, people have theorized that the movie takes place during the events of Season 2, explaining away the small cast of characters and the viaduct. Now, do I see this as plausible? That's a big ol' no from me, dog. Again, some interesting parallels here, but I do not think that this was at all intentional. Diesel 10 being on Sodor, and apparently having been to Sodor prior,
The Diesel 10's back! Oh, I've come back to find a lost steam engine.
contradicts Diesel being the first Diesel on the island, which also occurs in Season 2. And not to mention, the viaducts are completely different. A fun theory, though. Where was Edward? Sticking with the movie, now let's discuss this. Why Edward isn't in it. For some bizarre reason, Edward does not appear in Thomas and the Magic Railroad. All the other main characters are in it, but number 2 is nowhere to be seen. Producer Phil Furley has confirmed the reason why simply was he was never in any of the script's drafts, and added no value to the film as a whole, so no scenes were filmed with him. There's no denying, though, that his absence feels strange. There are a lot of other characters that also aren't in this, but to have all the other main characters play a part, and not Edward, just feels wrong. There is, however, another main character missing from this movie, and that is Sir Topham Hatt. Sir Topham Hatt not appearing, though, is a major plot point. He is away on holiday, and so asked Mr. Conductor to come to Sodor to look after things for him. This theory suggests where Edward was during the events of the film. He was simply away with Sir Topham Hatt and his family, as the engine pulling their train. It's a simple theory with no major evidence to back it up, but you know what? I don't see why this isn't plausible. I'm giving this one a yes, as I see nothing in the canon to suggest this isn't the case.
I think this theory is going to get a no from me, because there's no real way to prove it one way or the other whether or not it's canon. So yeah.
That's fair. Freddie the Mid-Sodor Engine. A lot of narrow gauge theories in this video. Like Proteus's, this one is also very popular, and one that many treat as canon. Freddie was introduced in Season 10's Fearless Freddie. The episode states that he is an older engine that is making a return to the railway, which implies that he's been on Sodor for a long time, or at least was there a long time once ago. When Freddie arrives back, the first engine he meets is Sir Handel, who states,
Hello, Freddie. I haven't seen you for years.
This, of course, implies he and Freddie have worked together before. However, Freddie has never been seen on the Skarloey Railway prior to this episode. So what could Sir Handel have meant by this? To make sense of this, many believe that Sir Handel was referring to his own Mid-Sodor Railway days back when they worked with Duke. The narrator does state this regarding the railway.
Other engines came and went, but Duke outlasted them all.
And thus, many conclude that Freddie must have been one of the many engines that came and went. Where Freddie has been this entire time is unknown. You can create your own headcanons about that one. But do I see this theory as plausible? I'm going to have to go with yes again for this one. It's again one of those where there's no evidence to really suggest otherwise. And Sir Handel knowing Freddie from the past really does solidify it. Speaking of Sir Handel, Sir Handel's maturing arc. As we all know, Sir Handel disappeared from the show for quite a huge chunk of time. First introduced in Season 4, Sir Handel was always an arrogant, short-tempered sort. He always believed that he deserved better.
What a small shed. This won't do at all. We're much too good for this old shack.
And complained when given work he thought was below him.
But I'm used to new coaches, not these cattle cars.
He often rebelled, and always got what was coming to him in the end.
I didn't think. You never do. You can start thinking now while you're doing Peter Sam's work as well as your own. That'll teach you to pretend you're ill.
Then, after Season 4, Sir Handel just disappeared. In Season 5, the show crew rebuilt all the narrow gauge engines from scratch to a larger scale, as the originals were too small and fiddly and didn't always work right. They built new models of Skarloey, Rheneas, Peter Sam, Duncan, and Rusty, but no Sir Handel. The reason given is that he simply wasn't a part of any of the scripts for that season, so the crew saw no reason to build a Sir Handel that wouldn't be used that year. this seems to also have been the same case for Duke. And as the seasons went on, the show just used what they had. No big Sir Handel prop meant no Sir Handel appearances. That all changed, though, in Season 10, when Sir Handel made his grand reappearance in the show, with an all-new big prop and all. Notably, his character was written differently. No longer was he arrogant and short-tempered. He was now wise and kind, and turned into more of a voice of reason.
Of course I'll help you. Follow me, Thomas.
His character changing wasn't exclusive to him, of course. All the narrow gauge engines devolved in one way or another during this era, and the blame for that we can pin on the writer's Bible that the show crew used, which had horribly inaccurate bios of the characters. Always gives 110%? What? Sir Handel's absence from the series is actually kind of explained in universe. The episode, A Smooth Ride, says that he hasn't been seen for a while because he had been spending the summer away at the quarry.
Sir Handel had been working in the stone quarry all summer. The thin controller, Mr. Percival, was happy to see him back.
Now, the theory explains why Sir Handel's character was so different upon his return. He had wised up and matured during this stint at the quarry. The hard work there toughened him up, and he learned humility and patience. An off-screen character arc, if you will. Now, I would love this if the show actually acknowledged that's what happened, but of course, it doesn't. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to give this theory a no. I love me some good character development, but it is totally obvious that this was not an intentional shift on the writer's part. It was more than likely them using the inaccurate writer's Bible and going off of that. If this were some intentional shift in his character, then how exactly do you explain the others?
Whee! Puffs Scarloey as he raced down the hill.
Let's finish off the model series with a funnier one. Mr. Percival's kids are adopted. This one actually made me laugh out loud, because I thought the exact same thing during my Season 12 rewatch for the retrospective. Mr. Percival's family is not seen much, though for some reason they popped up a couple times in Season 12. One episode even features two of his kids, a set of red-headed twins. Now, according to the wiki, a magazine fact file states that Mr. Percival has 5 children, all with P names: Peter, Paul, Patrick, Pansy, and Penny. Patrick and Pansy are the 2 redheads. In Season 12, we see what appears to be his children in a couple different episodes, and each time we see them, the kids all look different. Mr. Percival and his wife both have light skin and black hair, yet they inexplicably have 2 redheads, a blonde, and in one episode, a girl with different skin color than them. The only one that kind of looks like them is the boy with black hair. Now, I suspect the real reason is that Nitrogen Studios only had a handful of child models, so they kind of just used whatever to fill the scene. But as a result, the in-universe implications of this just might make you raise an eyebrow. So either Mrs. Percival is really unfaithful to her husband, or, as the theory suggests, all the kids are simply adopted. And I am more inclined to believe that, since they all appear to be similar in age. Now, I should probably also acknowledge the fact that none of the episodes actually state that every child we see with them are, in fact, theirs. The only 2 confirmed ones are Patrick and Pansy. But there's also nothing really disproving it either. The fact file says that there are 5 kids, and every time we see the Percival family, there are 5 kids with them. So, screw it. I'm going to say yes. It is way more interesting this way. The Percival kids can all be adopted. Why not? Good on the Percivals, giving a home to kids in need. Good guy, Peregrine.
Mr. Percival has such a bizarre and yet interesting life. He doesn't own a car, and he cycles everywhere, yet he has 5 kids. How did the kids get around? Like, sorry Patrick and Pansy, you'll be walking to school today. He also is somehow the controller of the narrow gauge engines. Oh, maybe that's how the kids get to school, huh? And speaking of his 5 kids, they might not even be his. I'm starting to question Mrs. Percival's loyalty. What a mad life that guy lives.
On to the CGI series. Two Different Canons. There has been so much discussion over this the last few years. The model era and the CGI eras of the series are very, very different from each other. Visually, of course, but also in their details. There's a lot to dive into here. One of the biggest pieces of evidence for this theory is in the movie The Adventure Begins, which is a retelling of the first stories of the series. There's a lot of differences, including Thomas's origins. In the model series, Thomas was one of the first engines on the railway, and was present for the events of the episodes Edward and Gordon and The Sad Story of Henry. In CGI, Thomas arrives well after most of the others, and inherited his number 1 from a retired coffee pot engine. James is also shown to be painted black until his big crash, whereas in the model era, he was always red. Henry's reason for hiding in the tunnel is also changed to suit the more warrior persona he takes on in CGI, and he is never depicted having an old shape. The CGI series stays consistent with the new continuity established in its own canon, referencing the events of The Adventure Begins several times.
Don't forget that time your wooden brake blocks caught fire.
Oh.
Hiro is also stated to be the first engine on Sodor. We'll get back to that in a minute. Some of the flashbacks to older stories are not always totally consistent with how they were in the model era. And there's also the fact that many characters just look totally different than how they did in the model era. Jack is probably the biggest example of that. He looks like an entirely different character in CGI. This is one of those theories that totally rides the line for me. Officially, all 24 seasons are recognized as one canon. And I know that the CGI era writers never intended for anything to be a different continuity from the seasons prior. They simply just retconned details to suit whatever they were doing in that moment with the show. Personally though, I think everything just fits better if you look at the two totally separate. There's so many differences to count between the two to justify it. And personally, I find the CGI series more enjoyable when looked at as its own thing. I'm gonna say yes to this one. It works better as simply two different canons.
I totally understand the desire to have model and CGI split, especially since it gives each canon a nice 12 seasons each. Perfect! But I think the canons split at a slightly different point. Keep in mind, Series 12 went out of its way to have CGI elements added to it instead of just going straight to CGI. We went from Series 11 having all models, to Series 12 having a model CGI mix, to Series 13 going to full CGI. And if you're going to transition the canon into a new medium, that's kinda how you do it. Even in Blue Mountain Mystery, they went out of their way to have the flashbacks be as close to the model series as possible. The real issue with canon is when it comes to The Adventure Begins, where it retcons things like James being black or the breakdown trains having faces, etc. I think there are definitely two canons, but perhaps the switch didn't happen after CGI. It came when The Adventure Begins came out. Because after that movie, the lining on Thomas's bunker carried over to Series 19, which he didn't have in the CGI series prior to that. Even the flashbacks start to change. Before in Blue Mountain Mystery, they tried to be super faithful to the model series, but after The Adventure Begins happened, the adaptations started to become more loose, such as Percy's flashback in Letters to Santa being much closer to the book's illustration than the show. Heck, even Henry's reason for staying in the tunnel is different in The Adventure Begins versus Blue Mountain Mystery. It seems like at first, The Adventure Begins might have been considered non-canon by the writers. For example, in Series 19's Rocky Rescue, when Rocky gets into a crash and has to be rescued, Thomas doesn't think to get Judy and Jerome. Also, Glyn is nowhere to be seen at Farquhar in that season too. It was only in Series 20 when they started to add Adventure Begins elements to the show, such as Glyn or Judy and Jerome, thereby making the special canon. And by Series 21, they outright started flashing back to the special. So perhaps there are two canons, it's just the line is drawn a little later down the road. This second canon is what I like to call the Red Lining universe, based on Thomas's bunker lining. And weirdly enough, the canon actually works out, since in The Adventure Begins, it sets up Thomas wanting to go see the world, and then at the very end of the canon, the last few specials and seasons are Thomas actually getting to go do it. So it actually kinda worked out in a weird way, but that's a story for another time.
Huh, an interesting perspective there. I never looked at it that way before, but I can totally see that too. As much as we all love The Adventure Begins, it did kinda have a ripple effect on the show, didn't it? When it comes to canon in Thomas and Friends, I think it really comes down to how you personally choose to view the show. If you're happier with it all just being one canon, retcons and all, and that's totally fine. That's definitely how it's treated officially. But if you like it split somewhere, then that's totally fine too. I don't think there's really a wrong perspective here. Hiro wasn't the first engine on Sodor. Let's come back to Hiro now. In Hiro's first ever appearance, the 2009 movie Hiro of the Rails, he reveals his backstory. Hiro used to work in Japan and arrived on Sodor a long time ago before the other engines, to presumably help build the railway. He claimed he was one of the first engines on the island.
I was one of the first steam engines to arrive on Sodor.
And then later said he was the only engine on Sodor.
I was the only engine on Sodor.
This, of course, does not make a lot of sense timeline-wise. The CGI series even later seemingly retcons this with the introduction of Glynn, a very old coffee pot engine that had worked on Sodor and was retired by the time that Thomas arrived. So, the question stands. Was Hiro the first engine on Sodor? The theory goes that Hiro didn't actually know there were other engines on the island, for he was the only engine on the branch line that he worked on and never came in contact with others. So his statement that he was the only engine on Sodor is still true, at least to him, because he simply never saw anyone else. Hiro could have worked a line somewhere in the north of Sodor, while Glynn and the Coffee Pots worked the Farquhar line, and Edward and the others took on the main line once it was built. I'm going to say yes to this theory, for it manages to explain away the inconsistencies without actually fudging the details of anyone's backstory. Hiro believes that he was the only engine on Sodor at the time, simply because he never met anyone else. Duke hasn't been found yet. And this final theory is another one that I suggested back in my CGI series map video. I came to the conclusion that the reason Duke doesn't appear in the CGI series ever is because he has not been found yet. For this theory to work, you have to believe that the model era and the CGI era are two different canons, and also have to assume that all major events still occur in relatively the same order as in the Railway series. In the Railway series, the Mid-Sodor Railway closed. Duke was put in a shed and forgotten about, and Sir Handel and Peter Sam went to the Skarloey Railway. Years later, the railway's controllers built the Arlesdale Railway to collect the lead spoils from the Mid-Sodor's old mines. Wilbert Audrey and Teddy Boston visit Sodor, and the events of the stories Tit for Tat, Mike's Whistle, and Useful Railway all occur. Duke's then Grace, Sir Robert Norrenby, the current Earl of Sodor, was informed of Duke still missing, and arranged with the Arlesdale Railway to form a search party. Upon their search, Teddy Boston fell through Duke's shed and rediscovered him inside. Duke was rescued, and now lives on the Skarloey Railway with Sir Handel and Peter Sam reunited. What is so interesting about all this is that everything needed to tell Duke's story absolutely exists in the CGI canon. Sir Handel and Peter Sam are on the Skarloey Railway. The Arlesdale Railway was built to mine ballast. Wilbert Audrey and Teddy Boston exist. Tit for Tat, Mike's Whistle, and Useful Railway were all adapted. Sir Robert Norrenby is an established character and is the current Earl of Sodor. Everything is in place for the Duke story to occur, and pretty faithfully to the books too, but yet hasn't. And Duke never appeared in the CGI series, which comes back to the theory he's still asleep in his shed and has not been found yet. It's a pretty interesting theory, and I would have loved to see the CGI series take on the tale. I can so easily picture Duke taking up residence at the Earl's estate at the castle, working tourist trains on the narrow gauge line with Millie, and having some laughs with fellow old geezers Stephen and Glenn. But unfortunately, I do not think Duke being undiscovered was ever intentional by the show's writers. As we established earlier, officially these are not recognized as two separate canons, and Duke's story was already a thing in the model era. They would never retell it, unless it was a part of an elaborate flashback special or something. So, this theory sadly gets a no from me.
I actually asked Sam Wilkinson personally if they had ever planned to bring back Duke to the CGI series. He said that the crew had talked about how he could work at Ulfstead Castle, but also travel along the line, as he said was set up in Luke and Millie's Series 17 episode. So that way Duke could work up at the castle and still be able to work with Sir Handel and Peter Sam on the Skarloey Railway. This was also one of the reasons why narrow gauge lines were added to Ulfstead Castle. We also talked about how Rheneas and Duke could be recolored into Bertram and Smudger if the crew ever wanted to bring them back, but this obviously never came to be.
God, what a missed opportunity there. If the show had only kept going as planned, who knows what we would have gotten. For this Pig of the Week, I'm going to spotlight 10 minutes of useless information about Thomas and Friends by A Sodor Life. I'm spotlighting this specifically because it touches on the Daisy Season 2 theory that we talked about earlier, and it brings up some other tidbits of information that support it. It's also just in general a pretty fun video full of random Thomas trivia. I, for one, never considered the reason Sidney's wheels on his CGI model turn slower than the other 08s until watching this. Pretty interesting stuff. I want to give a big thank you to Adam, the Thomas theorist, for taking part in this video. It was a fun collaboration, and it was nice to have some more guests on. Head on over to his channel for more Thomas content, and check out his reviews on other train shows. His latest one on The Transporters was quite a fun watch. At the time of posting this video, I am in Europe with my wife, and I will not be back until the end of October. There will be a few week-long hiatus before the next video, and I won't share what it is just yet, but I can tell you now that it's going to be a very informative one. I have a few major videos that I want to get out before the end of the year. I really want to get another Sodor's Finest out, and hopefully the Season 13 retrospective. We shall see how that all plays out. Before I end this, I just want to give a quick thank you to all my patrons once again. I really appreciate all the support and the patience with these new videos. These last few have taken a while to produce. I'm very grateful for all of you. And that is all from me, folks. I will see you all in the next one. Enjoy your Halloweens!